This girl I'm going to call April emailed me and she said, I dated someone that I'm pretty sure was not all human. Now, I can appreciate a masculine man, someone with very masculine tendencies, but this goes beyond that. And there's certain parts of the story that I just don't even know what to make of. So I'm going to tell you what she said and you can decide. April's at a bar one night with her friends. They're having a good time and they start talking to this group of guys. And in the group of guys, there's this guy named Nick. Nick's pretty quiet, but he's very intelligent. And him and April end up hitting it off. The first thing she noticed about him besides his intelligence was how hairy he was. She said it wasn't necessarily like a turnoff, but she was just surprised. Like hair spilling out over his shirt, and he had short facial hair, but he also had long black hair. Even though Nick was quiet, he very much gave alpha male energy. Like every time he spoke, the whole group turned to listen to what he had to say. He was kind of crass, but he was very sweet to April and she liked him. So when he reveals that he lives on the poorer side of town, it's not necessarily a turnoff. She's like, oh, where do you live over there? And he's like, I actually live pretty deep in the woods. It's by a lake. He's like, I really like spending time in nature. She's like, love that for you. And they start dating. The first night she spends the night at his house, though, she realizes that he was not exaggerating. Like he lives way out in the sticks. She said going out there, she had to turn off the main road onto a dirt road and then park her car on the side of the road. And then Nick came and got her on his four-wheeler. He then drives her on the four-wheeler to his house, which is basically a shed in the middle of the woods. And even the bathroom was disconnected. It was a smaller shed with just a toilet and a sink. And the first time they hook up, she's like fireworks, like very raw, very primal. She was way into it. She said in her email, and I quote, real good. Even the way that he cuddled with her was very like animalistic. Like he would nuzzle his head into her chest. He would rub all up against her. And she said, honestly, their physical connection was probably the reason they lasted as long as they did. Nick had some strange habits or tendencies that April just wasn't used to. For example, he followed a strictly carnivore diet. He said he just didn't like vegetables and fruit. And his bed was actually the top bunk of a bunk bed. He said he just didn't like sleeping close to the ground. For that reason, most of the time they spent the night at April's place, but sometimes she did find herself staying at his shed. On one of the nights she stayed over there, she had to go to the bathroom. So she leaves the house. It's dark out already. So she walks out to the back shed. And as she's walking back, she notices there's a strange symbol painted on the side of the house in glowing spray paint. She said it looked like a star with lines coming off and it had strange symbols painted around it. She goes inside. She asks Nick about it. And he says, oh yeah, one of my friends likes to do graffiti. It's nothing. She said the friend he referenced doing graffiti she had never heard of before. And by this point, she had met a lot of his friends. So she was just like, okay. This symbol looked familiar to her though. And she couldn't figure out why until she realized it was actually the same symbol that Nick wore around his neck on a necklace. It was a 7-pointed star with other symbols coming off of it. And she asked him about it. She said, that looks like the symbol that's painted on the side of your house. And he said, no, that's just a coincidence. It's not the same thing. She also met his aunt. His aunt also lived in the woods a little ways away. And they would go over there to use her shower. His aunt was really nice, although quiet. And it actually made April feel better when she was staying out there that there was somebody else close by that she knew. One night she's over there. Nick says he's going to go for a walk. It's dark out. She's like, what are you talking about? You're going to go for a walk. He's like, I just like to connect with nature. I told you this when we started dating. She's like, well, I want to go with you. He's like, no, just stay here. She's like, I don't want to be here alone. Like, I'm going with you. And he said, no, you're not going to be able to keep up with me. I said, stay here. And he kind of gets angry. And that was the first time that he had ever displayed any sense of anger toward her. So he leaves and she's like, well, you know what? I'm going to follow him. She said she just had a bad feeling, like he was cheating her up to something he didn't want her to know about. So after he leaves, she follows him. She's being pretty quiet and he's a ways ahead of her. And then finally he just stops and turns around and says, okay, come on then if you're going to come. So she quickens her pace. She catches up with him and he still stays a couple steps ahead of her. Once they get deeper into the woods, he takes his shirt off and puts it over a tree limb. At this point in her email, she said she's a country girl at heart. Like she's grown up in nature. She's not afraid to be in the woods. But something about the energy of the woods that night was different. She said as they walked through the trees, all sounds around them stopped. Normally you can hear frogs or insects and you could hear none of that. She said it was like the wildlife in the woods knew that there was a predator around. The trees had filtered all the moonlight out, so it was completely dark, and April was tripping as she was trying to keep up with Nick, but he was stepping like he knew his way around. April takes her phone out to use the flashlight. She turns it on, and Nick turns around and looks at her, and as he looks at her, his eyes catch the light and glow like a cat's. He says, kill the light. She said the way that he looked at her and the way that his eyes were glowing scared her, so she dropped her phone. She picks it up, and then she looks at him, and she's like, you know what, the woods are too creepy at night. I don't want to be here. I want to go back. And he says, the woods are not a place for you at night. I told you that. He seemed annoyed with her, but he walks her back to the house, and as they get closer, he says, do you think you can find your way back from here? And she says, yeah, I'll be fine. Once he turned and walked away from her and she headed back alone, she said the normal sounds of the night in the woods resumed. Like she could hear the insects, she could hear the frogs. But it was only when Nick left that she could hear them. She felt unsettled when she got back to his shed. She was just sitting there by herself and she's like, you know what? I don't really want to be here by myself. So she gets in her car and she drives a little ways away to his aunt's house. It was late when she got over there, but his aunt was still up. And she's like, you know what? I was over at his house. I'm there by myself. I don't really want to be there alone. Is it okay if I just crash here? And his aunt's like, yeah, you can sleep on the couch. Like super nice about it. She falls asleep and she wakes up. It's still dark out, but she hears Nick and his aunt talking in his aunt's kitchen. Nick is saying something like, I didn't get much, I just got a small fox. She hears Nick's aunt say, that's okay. By the way, she's here, she's on the couch. Be quiet, don't wake her up. His aunt also says, clean all of that off of you. April's pretending to be asleep at this point because she doesn't want them to know that she can hear everything they're saying. But Nick walks by her to go to the bathroom and she can see from his mouth down, like all down his chest, there's a dark stain. It's all over his hands, it's all over his arms, it's all over his chest, and she just assumes it was from the animal. As he's walking past her, he stops to look at her, and she could see him staring at her just through the squint in her eyes, but she was still pretending to be asleep. So he stared at her for what felt like forever, and then he went in the bathroom and cleaned himself up. After that, as she was actually trying to fall asleep, she was just trying to wrap her head around how he got a fox. Like, he was out there without a shirt on. He brought no objects with him that could have done that. Then in the morning, she woke up. She heard his aunt outside humming, working on something. She assumed she was skinning the fox. Nick wasn't there. She gets back in her car. She goes back to Nick's shack, and he actually apologizes for taking her out in the woods at night and scaring her. She gives him the benefit of the doubt. She's like, what were you actually out there doing last night? And he said, just walking. After that, there were some other strange instances that just eventually led April to break up with him. Like one night they were out at the bar. He forgot his card inside, so she was waiting outside in the parking lot when a man started talking to her. Nick comes outside, sees the man talking to her, and doesn't say anything, but grabs her, puts her over his shoulder, and carries her to his truck. Another time they were sitting at her place on the couch when she just had a feeling that somebody was going to come to the door. She says she doesn't know how she knew, but she just knew that company was coming. A few minutes later, there was a knock, and it was a Jehovah's Witness. She had told Nick that she had the feeling that somebody was going to come over. After the Jehovah's Witness left, she told him, like, I knew somebody was going to come over. I don't know how I knew that. And he looks at her dead in the eye and he says, are you a witch? And she said, what are you talking about? No, I'm not a witch. Like, I don't know. It was just a feeling. His whole attitude toward her changed that day. Like, he got real quiet and he ended up leaving her house early, even though he was supposed to spend the night. After that, he put some distance between the two of them, and eventually she just got sick of it, and she called him up. She said, you know what, I think we need to take a break. This isn't really working out for me. He didn't say much on the phone when she said this. He just said that he respected her decision and that he hoped that she would change her mind. She said she hasn't talked to him since then, and she really doesn't know what his deal was. She said she wanted to make sure that people knew that he was never violent with her, never angry, and for the most part, he was very polite and soft-spoken. She said he was very affectionate, and she enjoyed, for the most part, her relationship with him, but he just had some tendencies that she couldn't get behind. So what do you think was going on with Nick? She shared her story because she's genuinely curious what other people think. Let me know your thoughts, and I've been responding to emails for the last 2 days, getting back to some old stories, so those are coming soon.